Hello everyone, this is Wylam here. In today's video, I want to do a basic introduction to the X-T3, and if you're also new to photography, I also want to cover the basics of that really quickly. So this is someone who's just getting into it, who wants to know how to use their X-T3 systems. We're not going to go into anything complicated, and what I'm hoping to do is I'm hoping to build off of this video. If you have any questions based off of this video, definitely please leave it in the comments below, and I can make subsequent videos answering those questions and kind of build on top of it. So when you first get your X-T3, obviously you're going to have the body and you're going to have the lens. We're going to be talking about all of the major knobs. So specifically, we're going to be talking about the ISO knob. We're going to be talking about the shutter speed, exposure compensation. Up on the lens itself, what you're going to have is you're going to have a switch which allows you to switch from auto aperture, which is the A, and then down at the bottom would be manual aperture, which you can control with this ring back here. So most of the lenses will have that. We'll also be talking about the focusing system. So we'll be talking about this switch right here. S stands for single, middle one is continuous, last one is manual focus. So we're going to go ahead and go off with single first, and then we'll continue on. So the first thing that we want to talk about is how to get the camera into full auto. This is really easy. Once you turn on the camera, on the ISO knob right here, you want it in the A position. This stands for auto, of course. On the shutter speed one, you also want it in A. Exposure compensation, you want to keep it at 0 because that's where you always want to start it off with. And then on the lens itself, you also want that on A, which is auto. So at this point, the camera is in completely full auto. That way, when you actually take a picture, so let me aim at this over here, it'll decide the shutter speed, the aperture, everything about the camera settings. This is something that's super simple that everybody should be able to use right out of the camera. But of course, we don't really want to stay in this mode. We want a little bit of control on how we use our cameras. So on the next one, we're going to talk about aperture priority. Aperture Priority is by far my favorite. It's the one that I use the most when I'm actually out there just taking pictures for fun. Like when I was taking all those pictures out in Las Vegas, I was mostly in Aperture Priority because I'm trying to enjoy myself. It's not about going out there and taking the best pictures possible. So in order to do this, all you really have to do is you have to take this off of A, and now you are in Aperture Priority. So basically, you get to control the aperture of your lens, but the camera will still control the shutter speed and also the ISO. This is probably the most favored setting for a lot of photographers who are just doing casual photography because it's so simple to use, and the cameras nowadays will do just a really good job of taking care of you. So at this point, if you look at the screen right down here, you'll notice that it's on f4 right now, and when I change the style, it'll slowly go up. Right now I'm on f8. Can go all the way to f4. This only goes down to f4, so if you have a faster lens, obviously it'll keep going down. So this is a very easy way of taking pictures while being able to control your aperture. So at f4, I do get a nice little blurry background. I won't get as blurry as a faster lens, but it's still pretty capable and it's still really good. Now, if you're going to be shooting anything that's really quick, you probably want it in continuous focus. So you want to switch this over to C. This will actually bring the camera into continuous autofocus. And what you'll notice is that when you push down halfway on the shutter, as you move, the box in the middle, which is the focusing point right now, it'll go in and out of a green box and a white box, which means that as you're moving along, it's going to try to continue to track focus. And then when it actually gets focused, it'll turn back to green again. Now, before moving on, I just want to talk very quickly about this focusing box. Right now, it is nice and small, but if you were to push in on this knob right here, and then you see the focusing matrix right here, you can actually use your front dial, which is this dial right here, to control how big the focusing point is. So you can go from very large to also very tiny, depending on what you need. Once you have press, you'll notice that it'll go away, and if you want to get it back, you just push the dial again, and then you can slowly adjust it to what you like. Another thing to remember is when you have the Q button, if you were to push the Q button and you were to go over to the next one, the AF zone, so you want to go ahead and just use your joystick and move over. If you were to use the back dial and just move over one, what you'll notice is that you go over to zone focus. So now there's actually this larger zone in which it'll actually try to track anything that's within that box. This is something that's super useful if you're trying to track a target. Since we're in continuous focus right now, anything in that box will be tracked. So if you're doing any sort of motion, like trying to capture an animal in motion or trying to capture specific things like cars or airplanes in motion, this is a really good mode to be in. So I would definitely recommend a mode like this on continuous focus, and then to have kind of a zone tracking. So if we were to take off the lens again, and then we would go over here, hopefully you'll notice that as I move around, the boxes will try to track whatever is in front of it. This is super useful. Now, if you go ahead and switch this to single, when you push down on it, it'll tell you what part of the boxes that it's actually focused in on, but it'll only do it once. So I would definitely recommend this mode for continuous autofocus, but if you're in single, you're probably going to be better off with just tracking it with a smaller box like I was using just a second ago. So if you were to go back to the Q button and then you were to go back to the small dot, this is probably my favorite mode for single autofocus. But when I move over to continuous, I generally like to hit the Q button, come over here and go into like a zone focus mode. So we just very quickly went over aperture priority on this camera. The next one to talk about is shutter priority. So you would want to move this back into the A position, and then you would want to move basically the shutter into whatever shutter speed that you want. At this point, the camera has control of your aperture and also your ISO, and you actually get to control the shutter speed. This is actually a very useful setting for video, because if you're going to be shooting video, you want to have very specific controls on your shutter speed, because you don't really want it above 1/20th, maybe 1/250th if you want to get away with it with light motion. You're taking video in these high shutter speeds, it's going to get very jerky, it's going to get very unnatural and unwatchable. So shutter priority is actually very useful if you're just starting off trying to take video. You can just set it to 1/60th. If it's really bright, maybe 1/25th. But keep in mind though, if you're going to be doing this in bright daylight, you're probably going to need an ND filter of some sort in front of your lens if you want to get down to these slow shutter speeds, because it is very difficult. There is quite a bit of light outside. I'm going to turn this on real quick. Now, you'll notice that, say, from 1/1000th of a second to 1/2000th of a second, that's quite a big jump. But what you can do is that you can actually control it with your back dial. So you'll notice that I can be at 1/2000th of a second. If I were to control the knob, it goes up to it'll go up to 2500. I can go down to 1600, 1250. So I have a little bit better control than I do with the knob. But, for big jumps, you would want to use the knob. Now, there are times when you actually want to control both your aperture. So you want to come down here and say, I want to shoot at f4. But you also want to control your ISO. Say, for instance, I want to be down in the 1/60th of a second. At this point, what you have is you have the ability to manually control your aperture, but you're also manually controlling your shutter. The only thing that the camera is controlling at this point is your ISO, and it actually does a reasonably good job. So this is probably points where you want a shallow depth of field, but you want a minimum or maximum shutter speed. So you can definitely do that. You can play around with it. This is kind of a auto ISO setting. This is not really a priority setting at this point, but the camera is very capable of doing something like that, and it's able to adjust the ISO pretty well. So definitely play around with it as much as you like. Again, all of the focusing rules that we talked about still apply. This is something that's going to be super useful when you actually know how to use all of these dials. So let's go ahead and talk about the final thing, which is exposure compensation. I'm going to go ahead and go back to my favorite mode. So I'm going to turn this to manual, and then I'm going to turn this back to A. So right now we're in aperture priority. And what you'll notice sometimes is that when you go ahead, I'm going to try to move this up, and you try to take a picture. If you feel like either the picture is too bright or too dark, what you can do is you can manually adjust the exposure by using your exposure compensation. This is the easiest way to do it when you're taking pictures in either shutter priority or aperture priority, and you feel like your pictures need to be a little bit brighter or a little bit darker. You just use your exposure compensation. I do this all the time. Generally speaking, the camera can sometimes take pictures a little bit dark, so you might want to bump up your exposure compensation, but that's kind of something that you're going to figure out when you take more pictures with your camera and you kind of feel what you need to do in your exposure compensation. The only thing that I would advise you on is that when you're using exposure compensation is that when you're done taking that pictures, always go back to 0, because you're going to forget about it, and then all of a sudden all of your pictures will be at that exposure and you might not want that. So something really to consider, but there is a lot of power in these knobs. So that was a quick tutorial about how to use the knobs, and hopefully you understood it. If you have any questions, please leave in the comments below. I tried to make this quick video for one of my subscribers, Milton, because he was asking specifically on how I use it to take pictures. For his scenario that he actually commented on one of my videos, what I would do is I would go ahead, if I was taking any sort of wildlife, is I would go ahead, set it to continuous, so C on the front. I would go ahead and set it to manual aperture, and I would set both of these in auto and keep it like that. And what I would do then is I would go hit the Q button. I would go ahead to go over to the autofocus modes, and I would want the small area select. That way I have this box that's going to be continuously tracking my subject. Now, if I notice that my subject is always a little bit blurry because I'm not stopping the motion, then I can go ahead, come up to my shutter, and then I can kind of test what shutter speeds I need to be at in order to actually take that picture. Now, if you are actually manually controlling the aperture and the shutter speeds, if there comes a point where your pictures are actually super overexposed, the only way to really compensate for that is either to really bump up your shutter or have to use an ND filter in front of your lens, because that's one of the things that's going to be a problem for like outdoor photography, is that the camera's ISO just can't get low enough, especially if you're looking at trying to shoot wide open with a lens and also having a very slow shutter speed. So these are things to watch out for. But those are my general tips. Hopefully that helps you out. If you need something explained a little better, definitely leave it in the comments below. Or if you want something else talked about, please let me know, and I will definitely try to make a video on it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.